Before starting the round, I want to give a big shout out to Rada and the rest of, I think, Pasha and the rest of whoever helped set up this tournament. I think it's super valuable for debaters to have the opportunity to continue the activity while we are socially isolating and being responsible citizens. So, congrats to the debaters for making finals. Without further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister to do the speech thingy.
Hi, everyone. I will do brief pleasantries, then content warning. It's really nice. I second what Anish said. It's really nice to have an opportunity to debate, particularly because, people for the most part are vibing and just kind of debating because we enjoy debating, which is really what it's about. Especially debating with Anne is always wonderful, and I'm really glad that we got to do it, and I'm really thankful that she woke up so early to debate with me, and for the observers as well, particularly the people from Brown, although the rest of you, you're also good. Yeah. Okay. My pleasantries would be more effusive if I was more awake and in person. You'll have to forgive my insufficient emotion. The content warning is that this case involves discussion of climate change, racism, and to some extent mental health, although not particularly sort of clinical mental illness necessarily. It's also a four-way opt choice, so if people want to opt out of a specific aspect of that, I mean, you can't opt out of climate change because, I mean, you can, but like we'll just run a different case. But if you want to only opt out of racism or mental health, then we can just run it like three-way opt choice, and that's fine. So I'll wait, I don't know, 90 seconds, 2 minutes, message me if you would like to opt out.
Are you guys doing opt-ins for the debaters and judges, or just opt out?
Yeah, let's do opt-in. Message me, debaters, and who's the judges? I don't know.
Panel is myself, Sergio, and Karthik.
Okay, yeah. I guess opt-in. Let me even just check with everyone.
Does Facebook work?
That's okay. Waiting on one more.
Opt-in, sorry?
Yeah, but I think we've got everyone. Okay, cool. Do I have the document pulled up? Unclear. Oh, yes, I do. Okay. Okay. First, I have a little bit of a. Sorry? Did someone try to say something that mattered? Okay. First, I have a little bit of a mood poem. This is not part of the construct. It's just part of the vibe. So this is a bit of the poem Bacterium by Natalie Eilbert. The last segment, I tried sufficiency. They moved my femur, and a single woman braiding her hair fell from me. I tried to warn you, this desert editorializes. A scorpion lifts its tail, braids more active than braiding. It hisses, I of all people get it. In the mornings we wake to the kind of life we want until we turn our heads east. The night fills without us, but I warned you, I was full already. Okay, now starts the actual construct. So, you are a climate change conscious playwright. You're working in the United Kingdom, and you've been commissioned to create a dramatization for the BBC, so it has at least some potential to reach a mainstream audience, although obviously that's debatable. Single runtime, 90 minutes type thing. You've decided to adapt a story from Mike Bartlett's 2010 play Earthquakes in London, which was originally written to comment upon the intersection of climate change and our personal lives and relationships. Earthquakes in London centers around a retired climate scientist named Robert and his 3 adult daughters named Sarah, Freya, and Jasmine. Although for our version, we're going to make Robert Roberta just to get rid of some arguments. These characters have limited direct interaction with each other, and your version is going to tell an extended story of one and only one of these 4 characters. And Op picks the character that both sides will defend. So, Op choice in the true sense. So here is a simplified description of each character. You may not change any of these facts about the characters, and you don't need to know anything else about them. Also, as a side note, the real play, Earthquakes in London, starts with these premises, but then gets kind of progressively weirder and has more intense content warnings than this case does. So we're just kind of going to take the premise of each character and ignore a lot of the actual plot of the actual show. So if you do decide to look that up, that's the thing. So the 4 options. So Roberta. Roberta is a prominent climate scientist who earlier in her career accepted funding from airline executives to produce a study downplaying the threat of climate change. Later, she becomes so guilty over what she's done that she retires from active research and spirals into a cycle of alarm and misanthropy. Though her foreboding predictions about climate change are broadly accurate, her anger and alarm alienates people around her, and she has difficulty communicating these with them. She has a hostile or strained relationship with all 3 of her adult daughters, though each of them in some way struggles to come to terms with her later predictions. Sarah is a civil servant and a minister in a new government, which is considering a moratorium on airport expansion. Environmental activists unsuccessfully attempt to get her to push for a moratorium on all air travel, while the airline industry offers her a lucrative job in exchange for abandoning the plan altogether. Ultimately, she compromises and secures the moratorium on new airport construction as a policy. The airline industry in this play kind of stands in for like all the bad industries, I suppose. Freya is a teaching assistant who is heavily pregnant and increasingly anxious about the climate-related risks of the world in which her future child is going to be born. After a lot of worry and sleepless nights and talking to other people, she is finally convinced to moderate her fear and to believe that it is possible that her children will have a decent life if we all fight for it. And Jasmine is sort of a rebellious character who is kicked out of university. At first, she attempts to ignore her mother's predictions, but becomes increasingly concerned about climate change over the course of her relationship while she's dating an Eritrean man whose family is intimately affected by the changing climactic conditions in Eritrea. So yeah, those are the 4 options. Happy to go over that again or take questions or whatever.
I have questions, but Aditya, do you want to ask your questions first?
Nope.
The first thing that I want to ask is, you said that Roberta has a strange relationship with all her daughters. What does that mean?
Strained, not strange.
Oh, estranged.
No, strained.
Strained.
Strained. Yeah, it's just a difficult relationship for all of these reasons because she's, this sort of prophet of doom character now, and that's difficult for her daughters for various reasons.
And the case statement is that as this climate conscious playwright, which character should you center the play around? correct?
Yeah, something like that.
Wait, Sandy,
Yeah, sorry, I might have missed something. The audio was
does
a little.
does Sarah take the job?
No. So she's considering the kind of moderate policy. The environmental activists are like, you should push for a more extreme policy. The industry's like, if you don't push for anything, we'll give you a job. She rejects both of those and passes the moratorium on airport expansion.
Okay.
What is the so I know we're not talking about what happens in the actual play, but given that we're talking about which character to whose story we want to elaborate on the most, are we going to make arguments about how their story develops in this play, or do we know how their stories develop, if that makes sense?
You can make arguments about what the story would look like. We're not going to make any arguments about, about that take as a premise anything other than these facts, right? So Jasmine's story is about this relationship and the process of coming to terms with that. Sarah's story is about her coming to terms with having children. Freya's story is about this moral quandary she's in and passing this policy. And Roberta's story is about how she, her guilt and how she communicates climate change and research and these sort of things. Like, those are the sort of premises of these stories. You can make arguments in more detail if you want about what each of those stories would look like. But all of our arguments in case just kind of like take that as the premise for any warranting about what the story looks like or the effect of the story.
Okay, that makes sense. I have a question. The actual or the original book. Is it a book?
It's a play.
Earthquakes in London.
Yeah.
So you're adapting a play.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to think of this case as just like, sorry, someone has an echo. If you want to think of this case as just like, these are 4 ideas you thought of, which one should you pick? That's fine. There's nothing in case about the fact that this play already exists. We're just kind of ignoring that. It just feels like, I don't know, the play was the inspiration for the case, so I might as well credit it.
Okay, so there's no like deal that you're making in terms of like sharing revenues with this person.
No, you're allowed to do it. You have these options. Yeah.
Do we know how this play was received prior, or like what discussion around the play was?
The previous one?
The adaptation. Yeah. Like, did people really like were they upset about a certain feature of the play, or
No, if this is easier, let's just say I don't know, these ideas existed, but the previous play was never actually written and never was performed. So you're taking these ideas and making a play from one of them. But there's no relevant discussion of there existing a previous play with these characters.
when is this set? Like what time period?
Present day. I mean, maybe not exactly the present day, but like roughly the present day.
Okay, so the play is set in the present day.
Yeah.
Is there anything else? Is there anything else we need to know?
Don't think so. I don't know.
Okay. We're just gonna quickly chat about friends.
Yeah, take your time.
How was Freya convinced to no longer feel like the world was doomed and to become hopeful?
She thought about it a lot. She talked with some people. Like, there's no like particular sort of road to Damascus watershed, or like there's no particular like external event that is a huge catalyst. It's just kind of a process of coming to terms with it.
Okay, that makes sense. Are any of these people activists? I guess Sarah's like a civil servant, but like, there's an assumption that, or there's an indication that people are like care about these things. Are they actively pursuing like these causes, or is it kind of more of a passive belief?
So, I mean, Roberta is a former researcher who, at this point, is somewhat nihilistic and what's the word? Misanthropic about the whole thing. Sarah obviously is involved in government. The other two start out not being activists, but both of their stories are about kind of coming to care about this issue in a different way. So we might like plausibly assume that one of the effects of this is they get more involved in the issue, potentially including some activism. They probably don't become, full-time activists or something like this, but it certainly probably is not the case in either of those two stories that they just come to care about this issue a lot and then do nothing.
Are we making arguments in case about which will be more popular play?
If you want, you don't have to.
There's about 5 more minutes remaining in POC time.
Okay.
Are you guys done with POCs?
We're just figuring out who to make them defend, basically.
Oh, you get to pick who Gov defends too?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Sandy.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're creating a dramatization for the BBC?
Yeah, like at least some people are gonna watch this. It'll be on the BBC. Like,
Yeah, so
we
you're
can
writing
have
a script.
debates. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Oh, so is the debate like someone else is gonna take the script and produce it? Like, yeah, I
No, I
suppose,
just want to
sure.
be clear. Like, okay.
Yeah, like you'll be involved in this process, but you are a playwright. You're writing a story. Yeah.
Got it. Wait, so Billy, just to be clear, this is not about this is not a play. Like, you're a playwright, you're writing a movie.
Oh, it's not a play. It's going to be in.
I mean, I was thinking of it as kind of like a televised play type thing, because that's what you're used to writing, but like it will be filmed. Like, yeah, it won't be like
So
just like the live
West
audio.
End. It's not West End. Okay.
Yeah, it's not like a live play, but like maybe it's a recording and you record it live or something. Maybe you don't. I don't really care. But like, yeah, it's not like only the people that go to the theater see it live type thing.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think we are going to defend. Wow, first of all, I like this. This is very nice. It's a good case. It's a good case. We're gonna defend.
This is so much harder to opt than like regular gum cases.
Well, it's because you spend all your time thinking about what to opt.
Exactly.
Right?
Sorry, who did you say you were defending?
We'll defend Sarah,
Okay,
and you guys will defend Jasmine.
great. All right.
All right, just before you start, so Op is defending Sarah, Gov is defending Jasmine.
Mm-hmm.
Bet. Let's get on with this. Let's do this.
Cool. Okay, this PMC might or might not be to time, just so you're aware, but it probably will be closest. It's not going to be 2 minutes. Okay. So first thing we want to talk about is characterization of the threat that we want to focus on. Climate change will disproportionately affect people in the global south and marginalized communities in the global north. This is because in contexts like the United States, poorer communities and communities of color are the people most affected by natural disasters, who live without the infrastructure and capital barriers adapted to withstand climate-related change. They're also disproportionately likely to have their livelihoods disrupted by the collapse of agricultural, aquacultural, or pastoral systems, and less likely to have the networks to withstand climate-related disruption. It's also likely that political and collective and global action will be mobilized less quickly to defend and rebuild in the case of disasters and things like this. This is true to an even greater extent outside of contexts like the United States or the United Kingdom. Second, we want to be clear that there is going to be action to address climate change. Climate is becoming increasingly salient to a younger generation's politics, as it simply becomes harder to empirically ignore, as political trends become more globalized, and as an understanding of the effects of climate change correlates with youth. Second, technology is rapidly developing thanks to investments from both firms and governments, spurred by strategic considerations as fossil fuels inevitably become more expensive and governments compete to be the leaders in this clean technology market. Third, there is for the first time a nascent global legal infrastructure that can mitigate collective action problems and implement burden sharing and create broad-scale climate action. And fourth, the people who have bought into this ideology tend to have bought into an ideology of progress and are really invested in some ideology of progress instantiating in something happening. So we think it is likely that something will happen, even if it doesn't feel like something is happening right now. At some point, policy will happen, just as the coronavirus situation became suddenly more politically salient. So the manner in which action is likely going to be taken, though, we think will end up hurting vulnerable people. For example, geoengineering is likely to incredibly disrupt the lives of the vulnerable. See the anti-desertification methods in the Sahel driving traditional pastoralist communities out of their traditional livelihood. For example, the regressive effects of gas taxation or underdevelopment in the global south thanks to restrictive environmental standards on imports or agriculture. All of this is likely to happen because the people who are likely to be informed and care and have enough political capital to initiate action about climate change, especially in the global north, are technologically connected middle-class liberals who are able to think about the long-term problem, but not able to think as concretely about the short-term costs of the solutions that they might enact to more vulnerable people, or to tailor the solutions to the problems uniquely faced by vulnerable people. So we want to talk about why this play matters. We think, in terms of the uniqueness of this play, there's already a lot of discourse over climate change broadly being construed as and considered a threat. But it's seen as this kind of homogeneous, generalized, apocalyptic threat, and less discourse over to whom it's a threat and why. This is because, A, the type of people who tend to dominate the media and the type of people whom the media's reporting is tailored to. So this applies to other dramatizations as well as documentaries and news reports and things like this. B, because there is a perceived urgency of convincing people that it is a threat in the first place, which leads to a strategic exaggeration of how universal the threat is. And C, because the people who care most about climate change, paradoxically, tend to be educated people at business interests. The former tend to treat it as a monolith, ignoring the differences in how it will affect different classes of people, whereas the latter tend to treat it as a threat to them and their economic system specifically. So we say, particularly for the type of people who are likely to take the time to watch and think about a drama about climate change, the most important thing isn't convincing them that a threat exists, because they probably already believe this, or convincing them to take action because they probably already believe this, but helping them to narrow down what that means in terms of different groups of people. And in strategic terms, this is also really important, because if climate activists push for too many policies that end up hurting vulnerable people in the short term, this is an easy attack line against them. It kind of splits the left and it precludes them from coalition building among people who currently haven't been reached by climate discourse to the same extent. So I've talked about what the threat is. I second want to talk about how the play talks about the threat. Broadly, we use a story about love as a means to talk about environmental racism. Jasmine's arc has two distinct stages. First, her lack of direct engagement, even when presented with the facts of her mother's research, reflects the isolation of privileged communities and the specifics from the specifics of environmental consequences. The metaphor here is powerful. Jasmine knows what is going on and doesn't dispute the facts, but she's able to live as though the situation doesn't affect her. Second, she's gradually conscientized to care. How do we tell that story? We think that love is a powerful idea as a means of getting people to think and care about other classes of people. The classic love story, the narrative trope that people watching this play will be tapping into and reading this story against the backdrop of, is a story of coming to terms with difference and understanding the lived circumstances of another person more deeply because you care about them, stumbling along imperfectly at first because you care about them, and overcoming the barriers to expressing that care and expressing that knowledge that present themselves in all of the narratives we tell ourselves about love stories. We think that art allows hypothetical thinking. That is, it allows us to drop these guardrails we normally construct, the rules we place for ourselves about what thoughts we are allowed to think, our perception of ourselves as more informed and thoughtful than we may in fact be, and engage with the idea that there is a fundamental disconnect between the two characters that is impeding their relationship. In thinking about that disconnect, we draw conclusions about our own relationship with climate change and how we as individuals, even if we're clued into the science, may not be particularly aware of the nature of its effect on different classes of people. And once we've engaged in this hypothetical thinking, even though it's a drama, we can apply it to our lives more easily, because the mental work of reaching those conclusions in the first case is lessened. Once we've thought about it in a fictional context, it's easier to think about it in a non-fictional context. But second, what will this process look like? It'll look like conversations between Jasmine and her love interest. And these conversations will flesh out the differences, right? He doesn't feel like he can fully trust her at first. She at first cares about it because she wants to be in this relationship, but then gradually cares to care about him and his family and the issue itself. The process involves a deep discussion of the psychological process of coming to terms. We also think it's an inspiring story. People are generally optimistic about love and the idea of love triumphing over barriers, so they're unlikely to be disillusioned and repelled. The comparative advantage of this play isn't getting people to care in the first place, especially the people who watch the play. The comparative advantage is getting people who already care to think about how they care, to be humble about their role as individuals and their ability to fully understand the implications of these issues, but to end on a hopeful note, inspiring them to engage more deeply with other people and their different experiences of climate change. That's both necessary to solve the actual problem and strategic to solve any problem. And that's the comparative advantage of this play. We're very proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for their speech, and I call upon the Leader of Opposition to deliver their response. Hear, hear.
Cool. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, just give an off-time roadmap if you need to.
It's fine. I'll give an on-time roadmap. All right.
Here,
Three,
here.
There are two arguments. The vast majority of rebuttal will be integrated. Maybe I'll do some actual on-case. Not a big fan of it. First argument, so arguments are very simple. One, we're going to talk about why Sarah is good. Two, we're going to talk about why Jasmine is bad and makes it impossible to set away the narrative. The context I want to give here is who watches and thinks about something. Because I think that is genuinely, and the thesis of PMC is correct, which is the kinds of people that are going to watch a play like this are the kinds of people who are like upper middle class livers, the kinds of people who probably care about climate change. Sorry, I'm going to drink some water for a second. The kinds of people who care about climate change but don't necessarily want to challenge a comfortable status quo because they don't see a way to give in without changing their lives dramatically. That is, I think this is actually a very frequent form of narrative among upper middle class livers. It's people who are like, we ought compromise in small ways over climate change. We ought not fight climate change because doing the sorts of radical policies require us to give up a lot. What then is the most important thing? For this set of people, what you need to convince them is you need to convince them two things. One, you need to convince them that there are ways that they can fight climate change without truly giving in to the form of radical policies that require you to give up lots of things that you need to convince them that you can fight climate change without giving into the radical forms of policy that individuals demand they engage in. The second thing is, I just think you need to shame people. That is, I think in the vast majority of cases, the kinds of people that are upper middle class, the kinds of people that have the most ability to actually fight climate change are the ones who do nothing about it because they and their lobbied interests demand that they stay stagnant. The question is, how do you shame them into doing something? Sarah's narrative is the one that provides this on two fronts. One, it is the only one that offers a narrative of compromise. That is, there is an actual mechanism for reducing climate change that does not require you to give up the best forms of niceties that you as a upper middle class person have. The second thing is I do think it genuinely shames people, i.e. the narrative here is important. It is the airline industry trying to buy you out and you at the end having some sense of morality in rejecting you. This is a dilemma that the vast amount of people that have the actual political capital to change the situation on climate change face. And this is important because the way that you actually convince people to change is by, one, offering them a path to change that is legitimate, fair, and moderate. It does not require them to give up too much. And B, it is by shaming them into change by saying, if you don't do this, you are clearly bribed, you are clearly an immoral person bought out by some form of lobby. I want to give some weighing on why I think this is the most important mechanism for change. I do not think it matters. Like the highest priority issue is making sure that more and more people fight climate change. Why? Because the long-term weighing that the PMC gives about inevitably people will want to fight climate change. Inevitably, there's a generation of young people that want to fight climate change. And the question is, where we should talk about climate change occurring is insufficient for lots of reasons. The first is the urgency of climate change, i.e. it is correct, and they are correct in saying that young people may want to fight climate change. This does not happen immediately. This happens 20, 30 years down the line for lots of reasons, whether it is the established corporate interests that keep the vast majority of voters voting against climate change policies, or whether it is established political interests that cause you to want to lobby to the older voters or the voters in coal places in the US, or even in coal country England, which still surprisingly remains stagnant even after its collapse in the 1980s. The thesis here is very, very simple. What you need to do is you need to convince a set of people that they can change their minds on actual policy without requiring them to give up too much, because that is the only thing that makes sure that they actually have incentives to want to propose climate change. Why? And this is the second reason about why this is because even incremental policies now are better than the absence of policies followed by radical policies later. A, because of the urgency, but B, because it shifts the Overton window. I.e., when you have even incremental policies now and you make steps towards climate change now, that is the sort of thing that gives more interest into climate change and convinces more people that doing climate change and fighting climate change is a legitimate thought of view. The biggest problem in fighting climate change right now is not that people are like, I get climate change, I just don't know what to do about it. The biggest problem is there's staunch opposition. In the United States, you have what you call the war on coal, which is there is a set of people that is just like, we will not fight climate change and we do not want to fight climate change. For that set of people, the most important part is convincing them that there are legitimate ways to fight climate change and that they ought to do it, otherwise they compromise their own morality. Because literally anything else, even the promise of long-run radical demands, is not something the vast majority of people are willing to accept. Their case, at best, does not convince more people to think or fight against climate change. And I think it is a misconception to think that the people watching always necessarily care about fighting climate change, because there are lots of upper middle class liberals that like climate change but prioritize different issues. So they have no sense of why they ought to be fighting it. You need to shame them into it, and you need to show them that it is possible to fight it without giving up sense of. Sarah's narrative is the one that gives some kind of hope and says, you can do this and you ought to do it because anything else would be immoral. Second argument why Jasmine is bad. And there are two thoughts here. The first is, I just think it's so likely that your narrative of climate change gets drowned out in other narratives as well. Viewers have limited attention span. And as a director or a producer, what you care most is prioritizing certain things that you think are going to draw on ratings or stuff like that. And I want to be clear here. This is independent of whether or not someone writes a script. Like whether or not your playwright writes a script does not matter. When you have a director that emphasizes different things, that uses like lighting, or you have producers that are like, I want to cut this part out entirely. And so I think the problem is when you cram too many narratives, that is just what makes it more likely that either A, even if you have all these narratives, viewers pick the easiest one for them to understand, which is a simple narrative about love, or B, the producers themselves decide to cut out parts of this. And I want to be clear here that this is quite likely. Like in the vast majority of television shows or the vast majority of movies, which have lots of different complex ideas, viewers rarely distill many ideas from that. They rather distill one. It's like, oh, this is a romance movie. They don't distill the subtext that's like, oh, this is talking about environmental racism. Middle-class liberals are just like, this is a feel-good movie about a woman who like has an interracial relationship, and that's so progressive, and that's the thought they take away. Like, all the narratives that are in the movie and all the narratives that are required to set up are the things that make it so that you can't emphasize climate change consciousness in the way that you can. With Sarah, there is a deep and empathetical moral struggle. The question is, do you want to help save the world? Do you want to give up your comfortable life? Do you want to do what's best for the people? Or do you want to get bought out by the airline industry? That is a simple question. The vast majority of people taking away from that movie are going to be like, I understand the importance of this. I understand the importance of this question. But having a play that is diluted by lots of different narratives means that you never get that best case scenario. The second problem, though, is I just think it causes people to internalize the wrong idea. When you tell people that the global south is disproportionately affected by climate change, the thought of the average lobbied middle class, upper middle class liberal is not to be like, oh, we ought give them reparations, or it's not, oh, we ought fund them better. It's, oh, they don't know how to fight climate change. We should do better for them. The trope of Eritrea is not a trope like, hey, let's help Eritrea and let's give poor people more money. It is the government has failed to act, so we ought act in a way that is better for them. Think about Syria. The notion of 5 million people coming in because of a drought was not the important part. People didn't care about that. They were like, oh, the Syrian government failed to deliver on the promises of these people. So why is that bad? Because the end result is that the people with the most political capital aren't like, let's rationalize a way to help Black people or poor people. It's let's adopt harsher plans on the global south. The thesis that the United States gets when it's like the developing countries are responsible for the world's emissions is not let's give the developing world more money to compensate them. It's let's make sure the developing world does not have the industry because that's what's causing emissions. So you have protectionism and paternalism enforced on these countries rather than anything else. Very, very proud of this.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for their speech. Continuing the debate, I call upon the Member of Government. Hear, hear.
Cool. Can people hear me?
Yep. Oh, I'm gonna.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Starting time, just gonna go down the flow. The first thing they talk about is who watches, and they say that the people who are watching are likely to be elite, they're likely to care about climate change, they're likely to enjoy the status quo, though, which means that they don't have an interest in fighting climate change. And they say that the reason that you convince these people that they can fight climate change is by showing them that it's easy to do and they don't have to give in to radical forms of policy. So this is something they say a lot. I'm going to respond to it here and you can cross-apply later. This is the wrong approach. Listen, Sandy is right that action is going to happen in the PMC. The thing that matters, though, to note is that it really does matter what type of action happens. It is not the case that you can just do like non-radical forms of policy and we will be fine. We have 10 years before our climate change reaches a threshold of very serious, very negative impacts. It isn't therefore the case that you need to convince these people that moderate forms of policy can happen. We tell you, therefore, that the only way to actually impact change is to get people on board with more radical policies. We tell you that their side of the house, in which you have a narrative of compromise, in which you have a narrative of pushing a policy that Sarah pushes that is like decently small, that's just about airport expansion, that's not about like actually stopping airlines, is a narrative that leads to false solvency. We think it's really bad to tell elite people, you can continue with your life pretty much exactly as you have been. There's no problem with that. Don't worry, it's going to be fine. They say that the mechanism is compromise. We tell you that's a bad mechanism because you compromise too much. They say that you're going to shame. So I want to note here that it isn't just that their narrative is not adequate. It's also that their narrative is actively harmful because it leads to false solvency, and that it would be preferable to not have this narrative because it does imply that compromise is fine. They say, no, what you're actually doing is you're shaming people, right? That people will sort of relate to the idea of the airline industry trying to buy you out, and this will cause people to feel that they have been shamed into doing more. The problem is this is a really bad analogy because the vast majority of people watching this play, sure, they're elite in the sense that they are like, probably richer than like most people. They're watching the BBC, but it doesn't like they're not all like in government. The vast majority of them will be people who are not working this type of job. So this means that the idea of the airline industry trying to buy you out is a really bad analogy, and again, actively harmful as an analogy because most people are not actually this powerful, which means that they can very easily tell themselves, if I were in this situation, I would not give in to a bribe. The problem is that the way that climate change works is that for most people, it isn't as clear as like someone is trying to bribe me into doing something that I like actively know is wrong. The problem is that for most people, the way that climate change stuff works is like I have to vote for a policy that I don't like that would make my life harder, like some sort of a carbon tax or something like that. So it is easy on their side for people to look at this and say, clearly, if I were there, clearly I would not be, taking this bribe. This means that people think that one, they don't access any. This means that one, Opt doesn't access any of the benefits of shame because the shame, people don't feel the shame individually. It's not relevant to their own life. It's not something that they think actually applies to them. And again, secondly, we access offense here in terms of false. It is easy for people to think that this is something that they would never do, and that because the play uniquely says that this is the bad thing, the play doesn't say, for example, the bad thing is not taking a more radical stance. It's easy for people to think that the only bad thing is to like actively do harm, and that any sort of moderate policy is fine, even though that is not true because climate change is a serious enough threat that there's been lots of we all know this, we've all seen the IPCC reports, we've all seen the coverage of this, we all have seen the Sunrise March talking about how we have literally 11 years until we need to massively make a change here. So it isn't, so their side of the house accesses false solvency in two ways. One of the radical policy being enough. Two of I'm just not going to take a bribe. That means I'm doing fine and don't need to change my life. And this reduces shame because people leave the theater and think I am just like Sarah. And this is a bad thing because Sarah is not doing enough. They say that actually, because they say that incremental policy is important. And they say that young people want to fight but don't have institutional power, which means that we need incremental policies in the short term because we're not going to get these radical policies from young folks in the long term. The problem is this isn't true. Young people are voting. I don't know if anyone has noticed the fact that Sunrise ran a bunch of marches. They got, before coronavirus got, canceled them all. There were literally thousands, millions of people. Everyone has seen Greta Thunberg. It is the case that the young people are actually doing this. There are lots of polls in the United States that suggest that climate change is the second most important, after healthcare, the second most important policy proposal or issue area that people care about. I assume it's pretty similar in the UK. This is actually massively changing political discourse. It is the case, therefore, that there is a tipping point at which point climate change becomes a priority for people. Once it's a priority, it happens. Like Obama had a really aggressive policy that he was going to propose, but he didn't get to it because they did Obamacare first, and then they did the bank bailout stuff. And by the time they got the climate change, they'd run out of political capital. So it's not like there aren't radical policies that exist that would do enough. The question is just, are they high enough on the agenda that there's enough political capital to get them passed? We tell you that that is actually meaningfully possible very, very soon because we are at a tipping point here. So it isn't the case that you just need incremental change. It is the case that when you just do incremental change, you don't access long-term impacts because there's false solvency and because you spend your political capital on a small climate change thing and then you don't solve it. Further recognize that their idea that the only way to convince people to change anything is to make it seem easy is false. We give you a different mechanism. The other way that you convince people to do more on climate change is if you see and feel the impact, which is our side of the house, when people are looking at Jasmine and watching as Jasmine feels the impacts of this man that she loves and sees those impacts on him who they grow to care about, because the story is a love story, which means know each character well enough to care about them being together in the first place. So you have to get to know the Eritrean man that Jasmine is dating. You hear about his life, his family, where he's from. This is the other way that you access the impacts. We tell you that these people are actually willing to sacrifice a lot for others if it feels personal. This is why people socially isolate to save their own family member, but are less likely to socially isolate and often aren't if it's this vague and nebulous concept. This is like, we all know this. This is why people are willing to make immense personal sacrifices for those they care about, including people they don't know. This is why, for example, if one person's story goes viral about how like they needed money, there are tons of people who donate to like help them buy Christmas gifts for their children, but these people aren't making donations to like more important causes like the Against Malaria Foundation because that seems vague and different. We tell you that the personalization is way more important than incrementalism. They talk to you about shifting the Overton window and like how people don't prioritize climate change. They care about it, but it isn't a priority. We tell you that flows to our side because only on our side do they actually see climate change as a priority, because only on our side do they see more deeply the impact of climate change on the people who are impacted. The second warrant here is that they also see the impact of climate change and begin to get afraid that one day that might impact them, even though right now it's most global south. So that's a second reason why they're much more likely to sacrifice, because they want to avoid those impacts coming to themselves and their own family members. Second thing they talk to you about is how Jasmine is bad. They say that simple love narratives don't emphasize climate change. One thing to note is that a simple narrative is much clearer to people, and we tell you that a policy narrative about like this complicated policy dynamic that they give you is much harder to talk about. It's much more complicated because people think about governments and policymaking in much more complicated ways. There's not a consistent way that people think about these things because those are impacted by their pre-existing biases about government and about how that should work, whereas people much more similar view about what a love story is. We think a simple narrative is great because people actually remember it. They're way more likely to watch it also because they just like care about love and they don't care about a random policy. So insofar as you think that it matters that people actually tune into the BBC to watch this thing in the first place, it's much better if they're watching a love narrative because that's something interested in, and that means that they're actually going to access any of the impacts. They say that there's a simple moral question on their side. We tell you the simple moral question is too simple. It leads to false solvency. Finally, they say that if the global south is hurt, people think that it's like the obligation because the global south is like emitting to like adopt hard plans. The problem is this is totally like that is true that governments have done that at a national level, but we are not talking here about emissions by like, you know, by India, for example, right? We're talking about individual people and the ways in which they are impacted. We don't think that therefore the response would be to adopt harsher plans on those places. But even if that's true, insofar as climate change is going to kill way more people than those plans would, like even if that actually does happen, that's still preferable to literally millions of people dying because of climate change. For all these reasons, we're extremely proud to propose.
I thank the member of government for their speech, and now to deliver the final constructive speech of the round, I call upon the member of opposition. Will, are you there? I don't think we can hear you, buddy. Is it just me? Am I the only one that cannot hear Will?
Hello? Hello? Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Hello? Okay. People can hear me? This will be off flow. So you can like you can uh is this better? Hello? This is going to be off flow. So you will flow, you can flow accordingly. I will tag where I am on the flow specifically. Um, but yeah, is that clear? Hello? Okay, cool. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is who watches this and in what way do they internalize narratives more broadly, because I think this is a controlling question to a lot of the other impacts in the round. The PM speech essentially asserts that the people who watch this will be liberals who want to see climate change like progress done, but don't care about the global south. There are two problems with this particular argument. The first argument, the first problem is that it doesn't nuance the types of liberals that exist in the status quo, which is to say that it is not necessarily true that all liberals want the same kind of change with climate change policy. Crucially, right now, there's a debate between the liberal movement as to whether or not we should be taking radical steps towards climate change or whether or not we should be taking moderate steps towards climate change. This kind of debate between Warren or Biden, per se. Crucially, we would suggest that you need some compromise over to get any sort of changes over the risk or the possibility that there's absolutely no policy in this particular way. The argument from MG is that, it is bad if you compromise too much because you need radical changes in these kinds of ways. Number one, we would suggest that Sarah's that Sarah's story is not one of compromising too much, but one that suggests that you have to compromise with already existing powerful structures like the corporate movement. And when they say that young people are increasingly getting change, we just suggest that this isn't true. That fewer young people turned out to vote in 2020 than they did in 2012, and despite Greta Thunberg's popularity, she hasn't gotten any change. And crucially, economic concentrations of power are what force and lobby conservatives to veto climate change in the status quo. However, if corporate recognize that the liberals are willing to compromise on certain policies, then they're far less likely to do this particular action. Crucially, they say that it matters to get, massive amounts of change and you should only push for radical policies. Number one, note the risk way, and I give you at the top. But number two, we would suggest that marginal changes do matter, because slowing down the tide of climate change does meaningfully improve the lives of the individuals that they themselves say are most important. People like the global south. That is, if Eritrea builds up flood walls, then that buys people time to shift and move out of the city, or to do things like develop different industries that don't harm the climate as much. Slowing down and marginal changes meaningfully improve people's lives and can save lives in this particular way. But the second thing to say is that they needed to demonstrate here as to how the young people would overcome the structural barriers in the status quo. Because even if they can show that within the liberal camp, climate change is becoming more of an important thing, the problem is that the climate change movement has spread to become a widespread issue across both parties or across both individuals or across different actors of different political beliefs. And we suggested that corporates would still be lobbying against it if it's the case that they believe this. The MG says, in terms of the way it's internalized, is that people will now see the intimate effects of climate change, but crucially, PMC already acknowledges that people already care about climate change. The relevant question is the way you interpret climate change and the way you interpret climate change policy. The MG then goes on to say later on that, it's good that people internalize a simple narrative because that will make lots of people watch it and it's easy for them to internalize. But crucially, and the fact that she says this loses them the round, the question is what narrative they internalize, because that concedes the argument that Aditya gives you that they're not internalizing, climate change affects the global south in the way that PMC would have them internalize, but rather just that, this is a rom-com with a black dude, and that's really progressive and really cool. Which means that even if we have fewer people watching our movie, the fact that they're actually internalizing like some kind of narrative about, we should compromise with corporates to some extent, and we have to deal with these economic actors in a realistic way, is a much more meaningful and realistic chance of getting any sort of marginal change, which is crucial for this round. The second problem with this broader argument, though, that they make about liberals wanting to care about climate change, they ignore the method or the medium in which it's portrayed, which is that this is on national television. It's done by the BBC, which means it's likely widespread. And Aditya crucially identifies a group of moderates who are currently worried about the economic effects or trade-offs of climate change. That is to say that they do not prioritize climate change to the necessary extent that they ought prioritize climate change. And those are the kinds of individuals who we suggest and we signal that there are ways to, lower the cost of climate change policy to not, like affect their economic harms in this particular way, or to the extent that they wanted to bleed. But finally, and I think this is terminal for the Gov case, let's say you buy the best case scenario of Gov, that people become far more aware of the impacts of climate change policy to the global south, that people no longer want climate change policy that affects the global south or affects poor people to the same extent. We suggest this was horrible for climate change policy in two ways. Number one, it is incredibly unrealistic for them to get perfect climate change policy. No, PMC never offers a type of climate change policy that doesn't affect the global south in any sort of way. All policies, climate change policies, will result in some kind of economic regression. And crucially, it's very, very unlikely that you get this incredibly nuanced, perfect climate change policy under their side of the house. And and the other way in here is that it is better, and from PMC tells us this, it is better for people like herders or farmers in Africa that climate change policy is done. Even if there is some transactions cost they have to face, the fact that in the long term, they'll literally not have farmland to farm, that is a far greater harm. So you have to do something about climate change for those people to have better. This means, crucially, all climate change policy has some harmful economic effect, and this straps and constrains the movement of the liberal movement from ever implementing climate change policy with of the short-termism, that is the tyranny of you feeling like you can't implement anything because of the short-term harms to some poor people. And crucially, PMC also gives us this word, because what PMC says is that when people see the harms of climate change policy to the global south, they will, split, and this will be a rhetoric used to split the left. But the problem is, under their side of the house, they are literally broadcasting the harms of climate change to the global south. And that immediately splits the left. That immediately puts the left under the tyranny of the short term. And that immediately prevents the left from ever getting climate change policy in this particular way. We suggest that the left prioritizing climate change so much more right now than the global south is a good thing, because climate change policy is what will help the global south in the long term. And Aditya does a lot of weighing for that in his speech in a way that is important. Excellent. The second issue in this round, I'm going to talk about the specific narratives. Aditya tells you how you shame individuals into wanting to compromise and to do things like that. And says that this is a bad analogy and that people will not feel shame, rather they'll feel absolved. But we suggest that the way in which they internalize these narratives is that they put themselves in a situation that is similar in their own lives to what they were, so to what Sarah was, which was that I rejected my material well-being for a greater good. And this is crucially the way in which you get grassroots activism, because the reason why liberals currently aren't activated, even if they care about climate change to begin with, is that they're like, it's inconvenient, it might harm their own economic well-being or their own economic progress. But crucially, what Sarah's narrative suggests is that you should be willing to sacrifice your material well-being for greater economic or for greater climate change writ large. They say that the play is important because, or they say that you will internalize love in a way that is really, really important. But crucially, we suggest that even if love in like the abstract critical theory sense that, as Sandy describes, is an emotion about humility, that is not the internalization of that love narrative, because people who watch these shows are likely to internalize it as just another rom-com, just another movie about, just another liberal movie about love, and never a movie about how they ought to interrogate themselves and change their beliefs in a particular way. Whereas we strike at the central dilemma that every single liberal that is currently not active on climate change currently faces, which is whether I sacrifice my material well-being for the climate change movement and inspire them to be far, far better in that particular way. At the end of this debate, you have to weigh two things very, very seriously. Number one, that is to suggest that compromises and changes are incredibly important for getting benefits to mitigating the harms of climate change. That is, that even some amount of climate change policy is far, far better. It can have massive impacts on individuals, especially those on the global south, because they can mitigate the harms of climate change, and you can, do things like set up flood walls that prevent those harms from occurring. But secondly, and this was really, really critical, was that even insofar as they got all of their benefits, the magic policy that they wanted to get did not exist, and they couldn't point to us to a single example down the Gov bench, and you should not let the PMR point to an example now. And what that means is that if you buy the PM's own weighing that climate change is most important and affects the global south the most, what you do is you constrain the liberal movement with the tyranny of the short term from ever getting any climate change policy that would help the global south in the long term, just because they're scared of hurting the global south in the short term. We were so proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition for their speech, and I call upon the leader of opposition to deliver their rebuttal here.
Can everyone hear me? Quick pleasantries. This is a lovely case. Thank you to Sandy and Ann. It's always lovely debating with you. Thank you to Rada, Anish, Pasha, everyone else who staffed this tournament. You guys have done a truly exceptional job. Thank you to Billy for making me wake up at 7 a.m. today to debate and 7:45 yesterday to debate. It's been a lot of fun. It's nice to do other things, even if I have a lot of. Thank you, everyone. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you, Sandy and Ann, for a wonderful case, for being great people. All right. The easiest way to vote for us is off of urgency. The framing of the MG is crucial. There are 10 years left to fight. You need to fight now. The problem is they never substantively to you why their change actually manifests. They spend all their time proving why you get better forms of change, but this is insufficient. The thesis that Will points out in MO is that young people just don't vote the way that Anne says they do, i.e. they voted less in 2020 than they did in 2016 or 2012. The thesis, like even if you have Greta Thunberg, the actual change that she has implemented has been negligent. The reason is because there are corporate lobbies that have entrenched incentives. There are politically salient groups like coal workers and coal industry, and there are lots of elites that even though they care and understand something about climate change, do not want to give up the material comfort of their lives or are bought off by some form of lobbying. To be clear, this is the most important because the thesis from Gov is already that this set of people that is watching cares about climate change. So the question is not how do you give them more reasons to care about climate change because you accept that they care about climate change already. The question is how do you get them to rethink the way that they interact with climate change. Clearly, they already know climate change is a sufficient and harmful effect, or else they wouldn't care about it. The question is just, how do you get them to deprioritize things that they already care about? By admission of Gov, the fact that these people already care is damning, because giving them more reasons to care does not matter. What matters is showing them there exists a path out to resolve their moral dilemma. And I want to be clear here about why the shame stuff actually works. Because MG says it's not as simple, no one's ever really bribed about this, so shame doesn't really happen. Maybe it does. I think in some cases it probably does. Like there's a set of people that do and are bought off and are lobbied that will see this play and have their incentives changed. But in the vast majority of cases, I just think it comes down to how you portray plays. Like this is a metaphor that makes you understand that your pursuit of a material life, a more material life, is tantamount to bribery, and that there are things that you can do that are, yeah.
So this is going back a bit, but I think the argument that some people actually are offered bribes is a new response to an MG argument.
Wait, I think it's an LOC. Like there are people who are lobbied to do bad things. That's all I'm saying.
Oh, I mean, I think the MO or the MG argument was that like there aren't any of those people watching, but that's you can.
Also in the MO, there's specific argumentation about how people are confronted with trade-offs between material well-being and working towards a broader goal all the time.
Yeah. I'm sure the panel will take it under consideration.
Yeah, it's under consideration and stuff.
Cool. Yeah, so the people who are bought off, that's not the most important group. The most important group is the people who, when they see this play, are confronted with the thesis that them wanting more material lives is functionally tantamount to bribery. And that is what triggers all the shame impacts. But more importantly, I just think the fact that the play shows you there are relevant trade-offs that you can make is really, really important. What is the weighing on this? The first, urgency in the long run approach. The way that you get radical change is not by convincing people climate change is important. As LOC pointed out, it is by removing existing opponents to climate change. That is, the elites that are like, we don't want climate change. And this is how the Overton window actually happens. Because you getting some reform now, there are fewer people that oppose lots of reform later. That is why the LOC posits that having reform now is how you get long-run reform, which is good because it means that the prerequisite to them being able to access long-run reform is changing the minds of the established elites that want to block long-term reform. You convince them that is a salient choice. That is why they justify more long-term reform later, which means if they are correct, that lots of people are going to demand reform later. The only way that you can get it is by convincing the elites that don't want it right now. But the second thing is urgency. It is the question about shifting power, the positions of power at the top. The question is not how are these people fighting climate change, which is the question Gov wants to answer. It's are they fighting climate change or not? So we went on urgency here because the amount of time that it takes for them to get any form of change is past the MG's own argument about when it is actually important to get change. What is the end goal? Rethinking capitalist and corporate trade-offs, a different kind of RCT, is the only way to get any climate change right now. We win on prerequisites because you need short-term reform to get before you get radicalism, and we win on urgency. You need some change now before you get change later. The second way we win is the focus on the global south. Because one, it splits the focus on what the left should do. That is, if you have to justify to people both climate change reparations and like carbon taxes, it is harder to do that. Shifting the focus is really, really important. And this is actually MG weighing, where the MG argues that climate change is a bigger harm than the bad policies that they argue about in PMC. Will posits to you in the MO about why this is so important. That is, if you want to fight climate change, you are never actually able to access it because you waste all your political capital focusing on things that aren't actually important to the long-run goal of fighting climate change, but are just like, quote-unquote, better solutions for helping the South. Here's the problem. To access a ballot for Gov, first you need to believe that people internalize a message about climate change, which they don't prove, other than why people would focus on romance. Like, while a story is cohesive, it's very simple. We're torn between a moral dilemma. Then they need to prove that you actually do something good with that message, even if they prove that you get any form of change, which they don't. Very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for their speech, and I call upon the Prime Minister to close out the round as a whole. Hear, hear.
The thesis of the op is that there are people who currently do not engage in climate action or prioritize climate, and we need to get them to do this. We say that it is more important to change the way that people who are currently taking climate action take that climate action. Three weighing reasons that this is the case. First, LOC tells us that corporate interests and entrenched political patterns mean that it is hard to get new people to prioritize climate change. So it is easier to shift people who already care into caring and acting a different way than to newly engage people. The impact is larger. Second, on uniqueness, they miss the point from PMC that there are other plays in the world, and there is a lot of discourse about why we should care, but comparatively little discourse about how we should care or act. So our message and our impact is more unique. Third, likeliness to watch. Maybe some people tune on the BBC, but the argument wasn't just who watches it, it's who sits down for 90 minutes and thinks about it critically. Those are the people who already care. So why does this matter? Because not all efforts to solve climate change are even good. We gave you two reasons. The first was the stuff from MG about how small, moderate action creates false solvency. I think this is a more unique mechanism than the Overton window stuff, because the Overton window mechanism exists on either side, whereas the false solvency mechanism only exists on their side. But second, just some efforts are harmful. And there is warranting from PMC. Guys, I like BP too, but when in Rome, you have to engage with the on case. There is warranting from PMC about why this is the likely conception of progress that gets pushed. We give you a characterization of how governments and the media act, and how awareness happens, especially if it happens suddenly, means that this is the type of policy that gets promulgated. Some efforts are genuinely harmful. Things like taxes, things like geoengineering. These aren't just transaction costs. These hurt the very people and make them more vulnerable to the vagaries of climate harms. Did we provide alternative examples? Yeah, we talked about a carbon tax and things like this, but even if we didn't, it seems that we shouldn't enact climate policy and spend our limited political capital on climate policy that is actively harmful. The relevant question is what types of policy we are pushing for, how we choose to be activists. So how do we change how people who care about this and are engaged with this act? And their line here is just like, well, any story about love is very simplistic. I despair if this is your conception of love or your conception of all art about love. It's not just all unnuanced rom-coms. I think that's a very limited and self-limiting way to engage with art. We gave you a characterization in case, again, about how love is about interrogating ourselves, and that this wouldn't be an unnuanced story about love. It's a story about dialogue. Right? Because the characterization of what this story looks like is they have to talk to each other. And they have to talk to each other because Jasmine's apathy is the main barrier to a trusting relationship. And so the credible story, which isn't just a rom-com of how these relationships become strong, is breaking down that apathy through making her care. And in making her care, you also make the audience care because the audience associates with that relationship, every relationship that they've had and every person that they care about. That's how we access the PMC arguments about breaking down the mental walls we build for ourselves in terms of our thinking. That's how we get people to reconsider the effects of the policy they are pushing for, not just to see climate change as a big scary threat and push for any policy, no matter the details. But second, I just want to talk about what their effect is on the people who are already taking action. I think the fact that they introduced the Overton window argument into this round is crazy, because if their line is normalize moderate action, and there are currently some people taking more radical action, which they never make an argument is actually worse than moderate action, they just say some is better than none, then the Overton window argument obviously cuts against them. The mechanism that people needn't sacrifice to care is
Point of order.
harmful. Yeah.
Yeah, what are you calling new?
So responses to the Overton window argument, or even turns on that argument, are new. Because
Wait,
it came out.
can you say what you're calling new?
So Sandy is currently turning the Overton window argument by saying that there are people who presently engage in radical action, and therefore changes in the Overton window will be bad. This seems to be a new response to an LO argument.
I think the only argument I'm making is one that was in LO and also in MG. But, take it under consideration.
Yeah, taken under consideration.
Am I good to start again?
Yeah.
Okay. But second, on convincing new people to take action. The first thing I'd note here is that they only talk about one group of people you might persuade to take new action, which is the middle class, who have a lot to lose, and who, by this own internal weighing of the fact that they have to make sacrifices to take action, aren't the constituency you should be reaching out to. There is no engagement with the argument about how more discussion about environmental racism is the means to get the communities subject to environmental racism to engage with these movements in the first place. The idea that when we're talking about convincing people to care, that we should only fetishize neoliberal, like, I get APDA's neoliberal, but Christ, this is a bad strategy. Finally, the only line they have left is we should only care about convincing middle-class people who currently aren't taking action to take action. And the way we do this is by a Biden-like narrative. This is literally their advocacy, and it is laughable. Look, one, we also get these people to care because even middle-class liberals care about love. But second, their arguments here don't work. They want to both shame people and make people comfortable taking action. How does that reconcile? We told you that they don't relate to this policy narrative. There was no response. We told you that they don't relate to the idea of taking a bribe, even if the argument in MO that they are functionally taking a bribe is the case. They don't think about it that way. And what's the story about resolving a moral dilemma? People know that taking bribes is wrong. They know that being altruistic is good. They don't relate to this abstract, arcane story. I just think even if you want to adopt the Biden strategy, they have very minimal and potentially harmful impacts there. I'm so proud to propose.
All right, I thank all the debaters for what was a great round. If everyone could leave this voice chat, or maybe the judges can go to the second voice chat if you guys, the second out round chat. So judges, go into the out round 2 chat.
Thanks for the great round, everybody.
Thanks,
Virtual
guys.
handshakes.
Really cool case.